Okay, so this is our Merleau Ponty reading group, picking up after a couple weeks off. So we're continuing our reading of the structure of behavior. We are at page 198 of the translation, so we're in the fourth chapter of this book, the last chapter. So I won't really go through like in detail what we like looked at the last couple times, but in general, this part of the or this chapter of the book is about what is the relationship between, I guess you can call it the soul or the mind or whatever, mental life and the body, or in the terms that he presented in the previous chapter, the physical order or the vital order on the one hand, and then the um, psychic order on the other hand. So we have so for example, in the case of the um, human sort of understanding or the human mental life, we have these patterns or structures of behavior that are not only there for the observer, looking at behavior from the outside, but also for the person who is engaging in that behavior. So this is sort of the contrast between like we can look at the rat, navigating the maze, or the monkey trying to assemble the sticks to be able to reach the banana or whatever, and we can sort of understand the pattern or the structure of this behavior in this sort of melodic structure that he's pointed to throughout this book. We as an observer can understand or grasp this structure or this pattern, but the monkey or the rat doesn't grasp this melodic structure themselves. They don't have any awareness of this pattern. Whereas in the case of human behavior or human action, there's not only this sort of in itself structure or the structure that someone else from the outside can observe, but we also have a grasp of that structure. So we have this for itself nature of the structure. So as a person, so I think my example that I gave like a few weeks ago when we were talking about this is there's a certain pattern or structure of behavior that constitutes being a parent. But part of what it is to be a parent is having an understanding of yourself as a parent and behaving in a certain way based on that understanding, that you decide to do certain things and not do certain other things because of how you understand the role of being a parent. And so this sort of in itself and for itself side don't necessarily coincide. So what you actually do as a parent doesn't necessarily match what you take it to be. The role of a parent. We often have ideals that we don't live up to, or we our sort of self understanding of what we are doing is not necessarily accurate in terms of the sort of underlying structure of our action. But still, that for itself side is partially constitutive of the actual pattern of behavior. So like you couldn't be a parent as in terms of the social role of parenthood without having some understanding of what it is to be a parent and using that understanding to guide your action. And so this is sort of the distinguishing characteristic of this mental or psychic level of the structure of behavior. But then, of course, the question is, what is the relationship between these like the vital order or the in itself nature of the pattern, and then the psychical or mental order with its for itself nature of the pattern. And then, of course, like there are all these sort of classic solutions like Cartesian dualism, which is just saying that there are these sort of two distinct substances that have no properties in common. So the extended thing, the body is so the human body, just like any other portion of extension, is just this sort of inert thing that has geometrical properties, and it's impacted by other things surrounding it, and so on. And so it operates completely mechanically. And then there's the soul or the mind, which it has no properties in common with extension. And then, of course, the problem, which Descartes eventually says is, impossible to solve for a human understanding, is, what is the relationship between the mind and the body? So, of course, in terms of our like normal understanding of this relationship, we take it that our experience as mental, our mental life involves perceiving objects that affect our body. So you have light rays that strike our retina, and then somehow that is connected to our experience, our visual perception of the objects that the light rays are reflected from. Um, and then conversely, we also have uh, behavior that involves movement of our bodies that we take to be in some way connected to the desires that I want to drink this cup of coffee, so my hand moves and then it brings the coffee cup to my mouth, etc. Um, so it seems like there should be some sort of bi-directional relationship where um, uh, effects on my body have some effect on my mind, and then the actions in my mind or volitions in my mind have some effect on my body. But for Descartes, this is impossible, or at least impossible for us to understand, and we just have to say that God has brought about a unity of my body and mind, but it's something that I, as a finite being, am incapable of understanding. So this is not really a solution. Of course, it's essentially just saying there's no point in inquiring in this area, and so that's not uh, particularly satisfying as a resting point. And so there's various other attempts to try to explain what is the relationship between these different orders, and what Merleau-Ponty has suggested in an earlier part of this book, and he's going to develop further in this part, is that we should use this notion of a form, of intrinsic grasp of a form, or melodic pattern, and so on. We should use these notions to understand this relationship itself. So rather than seeing the physical order and the vital order as these two sort of atoms or self-contained spheres or whatever that then secondarily come to be connected to each other somehow, we should instead see them as having this sort of intrinsic articulated structure of that that the relationship between these two spheres is partly constitutive of what each of these spheres is itself. And so, yeah, developing that idea is sort of the project of this chapter of the book, that we are, seeing the working out of that project as we continue reading. Okay, so let's stop the sort of recap there and get into the next section of the text. So we are at page 198. I don't know exactly where we stopped on the page, so let's just start from the first full paragraph. If one of you would like to read from there.
I can read. Psychologists often speak as if the whole question were to know where the signification of the perceived comes from. They treat it as an aggregate of additional givens, and explain it by means of a projection of images over the brute givens of the senses. They do not see that the same problem poses itself with respect to the images introduced. If they are the simple copy of old perceptions, quote, little pictures, unquote, which are less clear, the becoming aware of these new quote-unquote things would still have to be analyzed once they have been brought back under the gaze of the mind by some psychological or physiological mechanism. And even if a, quote, dynamic plan, unquote, presides over the evocation of memories, it remains in operation in the third person as long as I do not recognize an illustration of the plan in the memory evoked. One does not construct perception as one does a house, by assembling the material gotten from the senses and the material gotten from memory. One does not explain it as an event of nature by situating it at the confluence of several causal series, sensory mechanisms and mnemonic mechanisms. Even if the search for physiological and psychological determinants were to make possible the establishment of a relation of function to variable between them and the view perceived, we have seen that this is not at all the case. This explanation would give us only the conditions of existence of the view. Since it connects the view with bodily and mental events situated in space and time, this explanation would make it a mental event also. But there's something else. If I look steadily at an object in front of me, a psychologist will say that external conditions remaining the same, the mental image of the object has remained the same, but it would still be necessary to analyze the act by which at each instant I recognize this image as identical in its meaning to that of the preceding instant. The mental image of the psychologist is one thing. What the consciousness of that thing is must still be understood. The act of knowing is not of the order of events. It is a taking possession of events, even internal ones, which is not mingled with them. It is always an internal, quote unquote, recreation of the mental image, and as Kant and Plato have said, a recognizance, a recognition. It is not the eye, not the brain, but no more is it the quote unquote psychism of the psychologist, which can accomplish the act of vision. It is a question of an inspection of the mind, in which events are known in their meaning at the same time as they are lived in their reality. No matter how evident the determination of the perceived contents by natural conditions may be in each particular case, perception, uh, perception by its general structure at least, eludes natural explanation and admits of only an internal analysis. It follows from this that the moments of knowledge in which I grasp myself as determined to perceive a thing by that thing itself should be considered as derived modes of consciousness, founded in the final analysis on a more original mode of consciousness, since the grounds for our affirmations can only be sought within their proper sphere, sens. The experience of a real thing cannot be explained by the action of that thing on my mind. The only way for a thing to act on my mind is to offer it a meaning, manifest itself to it, to constitute itself vis-a-vis the mind in its intelligible articulations. The analysis of the act of knowing leads to the idea of a constituting or naturizing thought, which internally subtends the characteristic structure of objects. In order to indicate both the intimacy of objects to the subject and the presence of them in them of solid structures, which distinguish them from appearances, they will be called quote unquote phenomena, and philosophy, to the extent that it adheres to this theme, becomes a phenomenology, that is, an inventory of consciousness as milieu of the universe. Thus, philosophy returns to the evidences of naive consciousness, transcendental idealism by making the subject and the object inseparable correlatives, guarantees the validity of perceptual experience in which the world appears in person and nonetheless is distinct from the subject. If knowledge, instead of being the presentation to the subject of an inert tableau, is the apprehension of the meaning of this tableau, the distinction of the objective world and subjective appearances is no longer that of two sorts of beings, but of two significations. As such, it is unchallengeable. It is the thing itself which I reach in perception, since everything of which one can think is a, quote, signification of a thing, unquote. And since the act in which this signification is revealed to me is precisely called perception, one must go back not to Bergson but to Kant for this idea that the perception of point O is at point O. It follows immediately from a notion of consciousness as universal life, in which every affirmation of object finds its grounds. Yeah, so rather than, I guess what he's saying here is that the difficulties with accounting for the significance of the perceptual situation in causal terms, whether that's by trying to explain the significance as a kind of image that gets thrown over the sensed image, or otherwise, leads to, he thinks, kind of difficulties that you can't get over. And so instead, this knowledge, the causal knowledge of the object, is derived from the initial experience of the object, which is, I guess, significative or grasping of the significance of the situation, which is then capable of being understood in causal terms. But it has to be, I guess, the argument is that it has to be grasped in terms of its sense or significance first. And then it can be known as objective or as part of a causal series, part of the natural world. But starting from the initial immediate apprehension of its significance.
Yeah, I think there's like a couple different arguments that are sort of intertwined in this bit. So one thing is, I think we saw this in the previous question, or maybe the one before, about there's this question of, so like different sort of psychological explanations of perception have and Descartes is an example of this to some extent, where there's this idea that like you take the, like, for example, the retinal image, you have a, like, the retinal image is a physical sort of image that the lens in your eye focuses the light and produces a sort of a physical image on the back of your eye, and you can actually, I think did some of these dissections. You can take like an eye of a dead animal, and you can actually like see the image formed on the back of the eye, from the outside. Um, so there's this physical, sort of process through which the image of the object is, brought into the eye, and then there's this sort of supposition that this image is somehow carried by the optical nerve into the brain, and this is supposed to explain how perception happens. But then, of course, the problem is that you have this image, this physical, uh, um, sort of correlate of the object outside of us. But then you still need something, or in your brain to see this image. And so if your explanation of perception is that it involves this sort of transportation of a physical image, then the seeing that happens in your brain seems to like it seems like you need a little man in the brain that also has an eye that can see this image, which of course just leads to this infinite regress problem. Um, and so the question, yeah, so at some point there needs to be some way of like grasping something that doesn't involve just this sort of physical or causal process of transporting an image, around through an optic nerve or whatever it is. And so this means we need to have some sort of grasp of something that is not a physical or causal process, or at least is not sort of reducible to a causal process. And so this is what he here is describing in terms of signification. And perception. So when I perceive a house, for example, there is some sort of causal process involving the reflection of light rays from the house that strike my retina and so on. But this perception of the house as such, so the fact that I see this house and grasp that it is a house, and not just a hallucination, for example, this perception of the house can't be reduced to some sort of causal process by which the retinal image is transported along my optic nerve, for example. So there has to be a grasp of a structure of some kind, or a sense or signification, whatever you want to call it. And so that's, I think, we could sort of translate the question or the problem here into like the distinction between a causal description and a semantic description of what's going on in perception. So like you can study in causal terms what's going on when the person looks at a house. You can see like which neurons are active while the person is perceiving the house and so on. But this doesn't sort of express what is the content of the perception, namely the fact that it is a house, and the house, the perception of the house has to be understood in terms of the signification or the content of what is perceived, which is not itself something causal. A meaning is not a something that appears at a certain location in space and time, and that can be affected by other entities in space and time. And so the sort of lesson that he's suggesting that we should draw from this, or that, I mean, he's going to qualify this a little bit later, but this sort of what this suggests is that we should sort of return to the study of the contents of consciousness, or the contents of mental life, in this sort of semantic sense, and just sort of bracket the whole question of the causal processes that are involved in this, and use this semantic grasp, or this grasp of the signification of mental life as the starting point. The starting point, and this is his presentation and his understanding of what it is that we're doing when we do phenomenology. So we are just sort of taking the significations that are present in mental life as such, and we're not asking what sort of causal processes are involved. So when I see the house, when I perceive a house in front of me, we are, what I'm doing. I want to describe this in sort of purely semantic terms, or purely in terms of signification, and not ask, what kind of physical processes or causal processes are involved in that sort of event, or in the fact that I am perceiving this house. And so this is how he sort of understands phenomenology as a kind of idealism or transcendental idealism, in the sense that it it takes the subject and object of perception to be necessarily correlated with each other, as opposed to a sort of empirical realism would take it that, I, as the perceiving subject, am sort of contingently connected with this object that happens to affect me in causal terms, and the object, has its own existence independent of this perceptual situation. And so for a transcendental idealism, you sort of remain in the domain of signification, in which the house as a meaning, as a semantic content of perception, is intrinsically related to this sort of grasping of the meaning by a subject. So there's no sort of existence in itself of a meaning independent of any entity that can grasp that meaning. And so, yeah, the semantic content of the perception and the perceiver that grasps that content are intrinsically related to each other, as opposed to being two sort of separate entities that come into this causal contact with each other, as an empirical realist sort of presentation of the perceptual situation would hold.
It seems, at least as best as I can remember it, that his arguments in chapter 2 tended to focus on kind of the visual structure of the perceptual situation, and that, his argument that you can't completely conceptualize the physiology without reference to terms from psychology was mostly focused on Gestalt, I guess, rules of or effects of perceptual organization. But it seems like that has to be true for, as we've just been discussing, for sense and significance as well. Or at least you could make the same kind of argument that Merleau-Ponty made about the visual structure, about, the fact that something is read, or, is grasped as having, I guess, any significance whatsoever for the perceiver of that thing.
Yeah, so I think, so this is, I guess, the other sort of side of the argument that's connected with the one I was presenting earlier. That so whenever we all these various attempts to sort of explain visual perception in particular, but he sort of takes other perceptual modalities to be analogous. But any of these sort of attempts to explain visual perception in causal terms, they always end up reproducing the same types of errors as the reflex theory and the associationist approaches, that take it that they always have to break down the perceptual content into these sort of atoms that then somehow get connected to each other. So, like, you might have, for example, like color patches in the visual field, for example, as like your starting point, and then the question is, how do we get from these color patches to the perception of the object that is sort of bringing about this perceived color in a particular location in the visual field? And then, of course, as he's gone through in great detail in earlier parts of the book, it turns out that you can't really sort of explain the color perceived at one in one patch of the visual field as a sort of self-contained atom that would have this intrinsic existence independent of the color perceived at other parts of the visual field. We have all these phenomena of color constancy, for example, where the paper looks white because the grasp of the ambient lighting sort of is like extracted from the frequency of light waves that strikes the retina after reflection from the paper. So so you can't sort of say what color this one portion of the visual field has unless you have the grasp of the ambient lighting that structures the whole visual field. So there's this sort of notion that you have to there's this sort of top-down structure, or this sort of intrinsically structured nature of perception that is irreducible to any sort of atomic sort of decomposition of perception of the perceptual object. And so for Merleau-Ponty, any causal account of perception would always end up sort of reproducing this atomistic or mechanistic account of perception that would start from these atoms and try to connect them in some way. Uh, and so once we sort of abandon this, once we say this whole sort of enterprise of sort of building up perception out of these atomic components is impossible to achieve, or is like a wrong-headed project. Once we grasp this notion of intrinsic structure as being fundamental to perception, then we have to sort of account for this notion of intrinsic structure as something that is non-causal, or that can't be reduced to just causal interaction of these components. So that's like another strand of this argument for this sort of transcendental idealist position. So that we have to start from the structure as such, this like articulated structure that is sort of intrinsically graspable, as opposed to starting with these atoms that then somehow get sort of connected to each other or incorporated into a structure.
This is a bit of an aside, but talking about color contrast stuff, I was recently reading about this French chemist and color theorist, I guess, named Chevreul, might be mispronouncing that, who was the head of like the dyeing division at the dyers at the Gobelin textile factory, who there was a complaint that he received against his, the dyeing department, that they had insufficiently dyed some. It was like black or dark blue, and he knew it wasn't true. And he like looked into it and discovered that the fabric had been properly dyed, but it appeared to be, a weaker blue than it was because of the colors which were immediately next to it, and sort of discovered this contrast effect, which can produce various optical illusions. And he was himself important in the history of painting. The Delaunay's in particular were influenced by his color theory. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, like colors in general are like much more complicated than it seems. Like if you just sort of naively think about colors, you say like objects have a certain color, and then your eye is affected by the light coming from that object, and then you see the color that the object has. But as we've seen throughout this book, it turns out to be a lot more complicated, and even like the question of what exactly a color is, like what sort of like ontological status does color have, is not obvious, because we see the surfaces of objects with certain colors, but we also see colored light, and those colors don't align in a very like straightforward way. And yeah, so like and of course, our the colors that we perceive are related to the visual apparatus that we have. We have three sets of cones, or different types of cones in our retina. And of course, other animals have different sets of cones. So most other mammals are dichromats, so they have two different types of cones, and so they would have a less differentiated color perception. So like dogs, for example, can't perceive the same range of colors as we can. But then there are other animals, like certain birds are quadrichromats, so they have four types of cones, so they would see more different types of colors than we do. But it's not just like a sort of finer grain of differentiation. They would have like a completely different sort of pattern of color perception of like different objects would be like sort of assigned different colors than what we perceive. And like we can't even really sort of grasp what colors a pigeon would see using its four different types of cones in its retina. And there's even, if I remember correctly, a type of shrimp that has that's pentachromat, so it has 5 different types of color receptors, and it's not clear like evolutionarily why this shrimp would have these like mega eyes. Yeah, mantis shrimp. Yeah, it can also see the polarization of light, if I remember correctly. Yeah, so they have these like superpowered eyes, and no one really knows why. Like what sort of evolutionary value these eyes have for this shrimp. But yeah, they're just like this example of like what exactly a color is. It's not super clear because the colors that we perceive are relative to our visual system, and then this mantis shrimp sees a whole different world of colors. But colors are not sort of purely subjective, of course. They have something to do with the physical properties of the surfaces and the medium and the lighting and so on. But yeah, so how do you express this sort of partially relative property of these objects that certain animals can detect? It's sort of a tricky question. But yeah, so in general, I think what Ponty takes, or the lesson he draws from this situation, is that we have to understand color not as a physical property of objects or as something that involves the physical or causal connection of the object to the perceiver, but instead as a signification. So that when I look at I don't know, a tomato and see the red color of the tomato, this perceived color is a signification. It's a kind of meaning, as opposed to a physical property that can be sort of understood in causal terms. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit from the first full paragraph on 200. Bats, would you like to read the next bit?
Yeah, I can read. Okay. The body becomes one of the objects which is constituted vis-a-vis consciousness. It is integrated into the objective world, and since any nature is conceivable only as the correlate of a naturalizing knowledge, there is no longer any question of treating knowledge as a fact of nature. Doubtless, consciousness itself recognizes that natural laws determine the order of its perceptual events, in terms of the position of the body and of the bodily phenomena. In this sense, it manifests itself as a part of the world, since it can be integrated into the relations which constitute it. It seems to include 2 aspects. On the one hand, it is milieu of the universe, presupposed by every affirmation of a world. On the other hand, it is conditioned by it. Thus, the first moment of critical philosophy will be to distinguish, on the one hand, a general form of consciousness which cannot be derived from any bodily or psychological event, in order to do justice to its analysis of knowledge, and, on the other, the empirical contents whose actual existence would be related whose actual existence could be related to such and such external events, or to this or that particularity of our psychophysical constitution, in order to account for the external conditions which govern perception as well as the passivity which we grasp it. Such is approximately the meaning of the transcendental aesthetic, but this attitude can be only provisional, as shown by the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. How, as a matter of fact, are we to conceive the relations of the given, quote-unquote, and quote-unquote thought, and quote-unquote thought, the operation of consciousness on inert quote-unquote things, which pure sensations would be, the connection of quote-unquote affection and knowledge, and the connection of sensible and intellectual consciousness? In the final analysis, then, there will be no sensible consciousness, no hiatus between the aesthetic and the analytic, and no naturalized consciousness. An analysis which would try to isolate the perceived content would find nothing, for all consciousness of something, as soon as this thing ceases to be an indeterminate existence, as soon as it is identifiable and recognizable, for example, as quote-unquote a color, or even as quote-unquote this unique red, presupposes the apprehension of a meaning through the lived impression, which is not contained in consciousness and is not a real part of it. The matter of knowledge becomes borderline notion posed by consciousness in its reflection upon itself, and not a component of the act of knowing. Sorry, I need to read that again. The page break made me lose track. The matter of knowledge becomes a borderline notion posed by consciousness in its reflection upon itself, and not a component of the act of knowing. But from then on, Perception is a variety of intellection and, in all its positive aspects, a judgment. Critical philosophy would resolve the problems posed by the relations of form and matter, given and thought, and source and body, by terminating in an intellectualist theory of perception. If, as a matter of fact, an incipient science, a first organization of experience which is completed only by scientific coordination, could be shown in perception, the alleged sensible consciousness would no longer pose any problem, since the quote-unquote original characteristics of perceptual experience would be nothing but privations and negation. Open quotes. The universe of immediate experience contains not more than what is required by science, but less, for it is a superficial and mutilated world. It is, as Spinoza says, the world of conclusions without premises. The problem of the relations of the soul and the body would be posed only at the level of a confused thought which adheres to the products of consciousness instead of rediscovering in them the intellectual activity which produces them. Put back into the intellectual context which alone gives it a meaning, quote-unquote sensible consciousness is eliminated as a problem. The body rejoins the extensions whose action it undergoes and of which it is only a part. Perception rejoins judgment, which subtends it. Every form of consciousness presupposes its completed form, the dialectic of the epistemological subject and the scientific object. So that's the completed form.
Right. So here he's suggesting some difficulties for this transcendental idealist position. So he's focusing on like a Kantian position, but I think this also applies to maybe at least one interpretation of Husserlian transcendental idealism as well. So staying at the level of, or in the sort of Kant interpretation level, there's the question of what we should make of the human body in relation to perception. So on the one hand, of course, I can perceive my body as an object situated in space and time, and then so this object is is itself a content of perception. It's part of this intellectual system that I grasp my body as an object that has certain spatiotemporal relations with other bodies in space. But of course, there's also sort of the internal side of the body. So the body is we take it that our perception involves some sort of bodily processes. So I see an object only if that object has some causal relationship to my eye. And then the question is, what is the relationship between these two sort of aspects of the body? The body as an object of experience, and then the body as sort of lived from the inside. And what Merleau-Ponty argues here is that essentially this lived body disappears in transcendental idealism. That we only have the body as an object in space and time, or as part of this sort of system of the world that we grasp in perception. But then at that point, the whole problem of like sensible consciousness or perception kind of disappears. So perception is just a sort of confused or incomplete scientific grasp of the world. So that there's this sort of completed science or this complete intellectual grasp of the world, and then perception or perceptual experience is just sort of an approximation to this completed system of science. And then, so then there's like, I guess the whole question of perception kind of disappears. It's just, there's just a certain physical body, namely the human body that I inhabit or am related to in some sense. And then there's just the question, I can study the interactions of this body with other physical bodies as like a scientific problem. But then I, as the mind that performs this scientific study, am completely separate from the body that is undergoing these experiences, or that is undergoing these causal influences from other bodies. So it's essentially just sort of cutting off the connection between intellectual life that performs these or that connects these intellectual operations with each other and so on, and then the bodily experience of perception. So the content of perception is purely intellectual. It has the nature of a judgment, and yeah, the whole sort of I guess non-judgment aspect of perception is sort of eliminated from the final picture of the world. And so, of course, this is going to be something that that isn't fully satisfactory. That we don't really want to stop here and say that perception is essentially just an incomplete scientific grasp of the world or incomplete intellectual grasp of the world. There seems to be something positive in perception, something that is not just a privation of a grasp of the world in intellectual terms.
I've read that Brunswick was sort of like a main figure, if not the main figure at I don't know if it was the Sorbonne, wherever Merleau-Ponty was studying, and that he was kind of Merleau-Ponty drew a lot of material from his classes and texts, but also frequently targeted him as a kind of avatar of this intellectualist, idealist position.
Yeah, Brunswick is someone that I want to look into more because he had a very important role in I guess interwar intellectual life in France. He taught at the Sorbonne where Merleau-Ponty had studied, and many other people that ended up becoming prominent philosophers in post World War II France. But they generally were pretty hostile to his position. That they a lot of them sort of defined their own positions in contrast to Brunswick. But yeah, he's a sort of intellectualist that he's the only book from him that I've read is a sort of so it's Étape de la philosophie mathématique. So it's I guess a history of the relationship between philosophy and mathematics, where he sees this history as a kind of progressively working out the contents of mathematical knowledge in philosophical terms. So it has the same kind of pattern that Merleau-Ponty is criticizing here, where the sort of end state would be this purely intellectual or this complete intellectual grasp of the world, and then the sort of historical development is just a increasing approximation to this end state. But yeah, it's the sort of intellectualist version of critical philosophy. So it eventually, if you sort of push it to the final conclusion, it ends up eliminating the whole other side of perception, or anything in perception that is not intellectual or reducible to something intellectual, is ultimately just a privation or a confused perception, I guess you could say, in sort of Leibnizian terms. So Merleau-Ponty is going to set up his position in contrast to this, as affirming that there is something positive in perception. There's something about perception that is not reducible to either an intellectual grasp of a content, or a failure to grasp a content, or a sort of confused grasp of a content. So just looking ahead to see how long this next section is. So this section goes right up to the conclusion. So I don't know, do we want to start this next bit or stop here? What do people think?
Either way, honestly, I don't really have a preference. Maybe maybe it's a kind of a natural stopping point, and we can start with a new section next time, and sort of caught up and reminded ourselves where we were in this session, and continue next weekend.
Yeah, I think that works. Okay, yeah. So yeah, we're at this sort of section break where he's sort of showed how a lot of the I guess arguments that he's presented sort of pushed towards the intellectualized version of transcendental idealism, but then he's going to sort of push back on that and give the other side of the coin, I guess you could say, in the next bit. So yeah, we'll look at that next time.
That's good. Yeah, the stuff that this next section is cool. I think kind of complicated and sort of reversible relationship between like empirical knowledge and transcendental knowledge. It's a pretty interesting position he develops.
Yeah, and then the other thing, of course, is that I think we talked about this last time, that we're getting towards the end of this book, so we need to figure out what we want to do next. So yeah, we can talk about that over on the forum over the next week and see where we end up. But yeah, it's something we should think about over the next couple weeks as we conclude this book.
That sounds good. Honestly, I'm kind of leaning towards Rouillet. I know almost nothing about his thought, and other than that, it's pretty strange. It would be fun, I think, to read it together. It's also, I think, Phenomenology of Perception is like 600 pages or something. So
yeah, Phenomenology of Perception is quite big. Yeah, Rouillet is very strange guy. He like one of the books, I think it's not translated yet, but he like essentially makes up this like idea that there's like this
Gnosis of
Gnostic.
Princeton.
Yeah, exactly. That he like makes up this Gnostic sect that would supposedly like has an underground presence at Princeton. I haven't read that book, so I don't know like why he sort of does this. But yeah, so a couple of his books are translated. We can look at one of those. But yeah, so he comes out of like sort of a similar intellectual context as Merleau Ponty and Simondon, but he takes things in a different direction than either of them. So it might be interesting to sort of triangulate between these three people that use a lot of the same materials about like Gestalt psychology, for example, and like figure out like what sort of decisions are they making that take each of them in different directions.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Cool. Okay, so we can end here. So yeah, thanks for coming out. Thanks for your contributions, and we can continue with this next.